Steam rose in delicate spirals, clouding the edges of vision, clinging to the ceiling like a hesitant ghost. The women stood at the threshold of the tiled room, boots scuffing against the concrete floor, clutching their thin uniforms as if they were shields against an unknown ritual. They had crossed the Atlantic in crowded ships, seasick and silent, expecting shackles, starvation, perhaps the cruelty their own propaganda had promised. Instead, a guard had gestured toward the space, his English clipped, his tone brusque but not unkind. The sound that met them was alien. The steady hiss of running water, hot and endless, like some industrial miracle. For years, many had washed in basins no bigger than a bread pan, splashing icy water against skin already stiff with hunger. Soap, when it appeared, was a sliver passed carefully from hand to hand, worn to nothing by weeks of sharing. Now, without warning, they were herded toward rows of nozzles that gushed warmth. One woman, perhaps 25, with straw-colored hair cropped short under her headscarf, touched the spray with trembling fingers and recoiled as if it might scald. Then, tentatively, she stepped forward, letting the heat spill over her face and gasped, not from pain, but from an unfamiliar comfort. The others followed, some with suspicion, some with open disbelief. A nurse in her 30s, once proud in her uniform but now pale from months of war, closed her eyes as the water coursed over her shoulders. Tears mingled with the steam, indistinguishable to anyone watching. She remembered scrubbing blood from linens in makeshift hospitals, remembered the sting of cold water on raw hands. Here, warmth soothed the ache. For the first time since capture, her body unclenched. Whispers traveled among them, quick and uneasy. Was this indulgence a trick? Were they being softened for interrogation, or mocked with luxuries before some harsher punishment? The absurdity of such doubts made them laugh bitterly, yet the laughter itself felt dangerous, as though yielding to relief might mark them as weak. Still, shoulders relaxed, fingers lingered at soap bars stacked neatly on shelves. A younger girl, barely 20, held one to her nose, inhaling the faint scent of lavender. She whispered to herself in German a single word to him, home. Outside those showers, the world was still at war. Cities lay in rubble, families starved, and skies cracked open under bombers' thunder. But in that confined space, time bent strangely. The sound of rushing water muffled the memory of explosions. The steam wrapped around them like a fabric they had not worn in years. The fabric of normalcy, of forgotten dignity. Each droplet became a reminder of something their own government had long denied them. That mercy could come from unexpected hands. The guards leaned against the wall outside, trading cigarettes and half-smiles, unaware that they were orchestrating a quiet revolution. For them, hygiene was policy, nothing more. Disease bred unrest, unrest bred paperwork, and paperwork was to be avoided at all costs. But for the women, this moment rearranged the boundaries of belief. They had been told Americans were brutes, uncultured and merciless. Yet here was warmth falling freely from steel pipes, here was soap carved in clean rectangles, here was an enemy who had chosen order over vengeance. The nurse pressed her palms to her face, breathing deeply. She could feel old fears loosening, though not vanishing. The propaganda lingered like smoke, whispering that kindness was camouflage. But the heat against her skin insisted otherwise. Another woman, older, hardened by hunger and grief, muttered that nothing good could last, that comfort was only a prelude to disappointment. Her words carried weight, but they could not fully dissolve the simple fact. For the first time in months, they were clean. The act itself was intimate, almost humiliating. Stripped of possessions, stripped of rank, they were left only with themselves, their bodies exposed not to ridicule, but to relief. In that paradox lay the conflict. Were they prisoners, or were they something else, living exhibits of America's power, both military and moral? The answer hovered unresolved, suspended like the steam above their heads. When they emerged, hair damp and cheeks flushed, the air outside struck cold against their skin. They clutched their uniforms tighter, but their eyes were different now, brighter with the sheen of disbelief. Some exchanged glances that bordered on gratitude, though none dared voice it aloud. Gratitude for an enemy felt treacherous. Yet inside, each carried the seed of a dangerous thought. Perhaps the world was not as their leaders had described it. The girl with the lavender soap pressed the bar into her pocket as they marched back toward the barracks. She knew it would wear down quickly, used or unused, but she wanted to keep it as proof, a small, fragrant relic of a day when the world tilted unexpectedly. Around her, the others walked in silence, footsteps crunching on gravel, guards' boots echoing at their sides. The nurse lingered at the back, her gaze fixed on the ground, though her mind swam with questions she dared not ask. Beyond the fences, the American sky stretched wide, indifferent to their confusion. Birds circled lazily, fields rolled out toward the horizon. It was a land that seemed untouched by the war-devouring Europe, a land where even prisoners could bathe in hot water. Yet the barbed wire reminded them with every glint that they were not free. Comfort could coexist with captivity, mercy with control. That contradiction would haunt them long after the steam had faded. As night fell over the camp, the women settled into bunks that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Sleep came slowly. Some dreamed of kitchens back home, of mothers stirring soups they had not tasted in years. Others dreamed of firebombs, of air raid sirens, of running with buckets toward the blaze. And some dreamed only of water, falling endlessly, impossibly, against their skin. The girl with the soap woke once in the dark, pressed the bar to her lips, and closed her eyes. She thought of her brother, lost at the front, of her mother's weary hands, of all she could not change. She wondered if the Americans would be as merciful tomorrow, or if this day was an accident, a fleeting kindness in a war built on cruelty. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but the memory of warmth lingered stubbornly. And so, even as the camp quieted, a single question, unspoken yet alive in every mind, drifted with the steam into the night. If this was captivity, what would freedom feel like? Barbed wire stretched like a silver ribbon under the Midwestern sun, taut and unyielding, a boundary that shimmered deceptively in the heat. Behind it, the camp pulsed with its own strange rhythm. Boots on gravel, the clang of mess hall trays, the low murmur of voices in languages braided by distance and war. For the women, fewer in number and scattered across certain compounds, life was a paradox. Freedom visible just beyond the fence, yet daily existence shaped by a peculiar abundance they had not known in years. The nurse with the straw-colored hair, now shorn shorter for convenience, began to rise before dawn, her body conditioned by years of labor. She would stand at the narrow window, watching the fog drift low over the surrounding fields. Once she had imagined America as little more than a hostile idea, but here she saw farms not so different from her homeland. Rows of corn and barns painted red, the smell of earth after rain. The contradiction unsettled her, but it also softened her resolve, eroding the edges of the enemy image carved into her mind. Each morning, guards barked roll call, though the tone was more habit than menace. The women lined up, uniforms stenciled with PW, like a brand yet oddly clean, their boots polished by routine. Then came breakfast, a ritual that shocked them every time. Eggs, toast, butter, even coffee, luxuries unimaginable in the ruins of Germany. At first they ate cautiously, suspicious of poison or trickery, but hunger soon silenced doubts. The young girl with the lavender soap often lingered over her bread, staring at the pale square of butter as if it were a jewel. She would press her tongue to it slowly, memorizing the taste in case she never encountered it again. Work filled the days, though its form varied. Some women sewed uniforms in long, drafty warehouses, needles clicking like metronomes of monotony. Others were led into nearby fields to harvest crops, their skirts brushing against rows of sugar beets or cotton. Under the watch of armed guards, they bent to the soil, hands blistering, backs aching. And yet, there was an unexpected freedom in the labor. Sunlight on their faces, laughter when chickens scattered across the rows, the rustle of wind in tall grass. A Nebraska farmer's wife once brought them lemonade, and though the guards frowned, she insisted, pouring glass after glass into their calloused hands. The women drank with silent gratitude, bewildered by such small kindness. Letters home provided another tether to a world they no longer recognized. Each page was censored, sentences blotted by ink where words might betray secrets. Still, they wrote of food, of health, of survival, careful not to describe too much, but careful, too, to reassure mothers and children who might believe them dead. One woman asked her mother to send her a recipe for plum cake, not because she could bake it here, but because the memory of the smell might sustain her. Evenings brought a different kind of life. Some camps organized makeshift theaters, where women draped burlap sacks into costumes and acted out scenes from Goethe or improvised tragedies of their own invention. Laughter rose through the barracks like smoke, a laughter that startled even the guards. One soldier later admitted he had never imagined his enemy could sound so much like his sisters at home. Music carried, too, German lullabies sung in soft voices, sometimes joined by hesitant American harmonies. In these moments, the line between captive and captor blurred. Yet the fence never disappeared. Its shadow fell across every field, its shape framed every horizon. The abundance within the wire, meals, work, medical care, was haunted by the knowledge that beyond it lay liberty, even if liberty meant rubble and hunger. The women wrestled with this contradiction nightly. To feel safer in captivity than they might at home was a truth they could not voice without shame. Humor became a fragile coping mechanism. The young girl teased the guards' clumsy German, imitating their accents until the barracks shook with muffled giggles. The nurse, sterner in demeanor, rolled her eyes but could not suppress a smile. Even the older, skeptical woman, who often muttered that kindness was temporary, found herself laughing at a guard who tripped over a chicken in the yard. These absurdities stitched humanity into the fabric of their captivity. Still, suspicions lingered. Rumors circulated that not all camps were alike, that somewhere prisoners faced harsher treatment. Whispers painted shadows across the barracks, and yet those whispers could not erase the tangible comforts. The warmth of showers, the richness of food, the occasional kindness of a stranger. The paradox deepened, as if every bite and every gesture asked them silently to reconsider what they thought they knew of enemies. One night, as rain hammered the tin roofs and wind rattled the fences, the nurse sat awake, cradling a letter half-finished. She stared at the words she dared not write. That captivity, though heavy with longing, had given her more sustenance than freedom once had. She folded the page carefully, hiding her confession even from herself. Across the room, the girl with the soap clutched her pocket, the bar still intact, her talisman of unexpected grace. The camp lights dimmed, and the compound hushed. Outside, the cornfields swayed like dark water under the storm. Inside, the women drifted toward sleep, each carrying her own confusion, her own fracture between belief and experience. Tomorrow would bring work, food, perhaps even laughter. Yet always, the fence glistened in the dawn, reminding them that kindness could still be a cage. And as the rain slowed to a whisper, one thought pressed into every restless heart. If captivity could feel like this, what shadows awaited them in freedom? By the spring of 1945, the strangeness of captivity had begun to wear grooves into their minds, unsettling in its routine comfort. The nurse who once braced for cruelty now found herself pausing at the sight of steam curling from the mess hall kitchen, recognizing with unease that her stomach no longer twisted in suspicion, but in simple hunger. The girl with the lavender soap tucked in her pocket still touched it each night before sleep, though the sharp edges of fear had dulled. Around them, the camp's rhythms continued, roll calls, labor details, laughter over mistranslated words. But beneath it all, a quieter transformation was stirring, as subtle as grass pushing through concrete. The propaganda they had absorbed for years had promised brutality. Americans, they had been told, were barbaric, greedy, merciless. Yet here they were, being fed, clothed, and even offered medical treatment that some had not seen in years. A doctor, young and bespectacled, treated a prisoner's infected hand with gentleness that startled her into silence. She stared at him afterward, unable to reconcile his careful stitching with the monstrous image painted by her homeland's broadcasts. Later, whispering in the barracks, she confessed the thought aloud. Others nodded reluctantly, as though admitting such a thing carried the weight of treason. Meals became the daily theater of contradiction. Plates of meatloaf, beans, even fresh vegetables unsettled them, not because the food was unfamiliar, but because it was abundant. They had heard from letters that their families in Berlin or Hamburg scraped by on meager rations, sometimes no more than watery soup. Here, prisoners, consumed more calories than their children. It was a truth almost too heavy to swallow, a truth that soured even as it nourished. Some women ate quickly, guiltily, as though their very survival mocked the suffering of their kin. The nurse often stared at her portion before touching it, whispering a silent apology in German to her younger brother, who she feared was starving back home. Yet, when hunger demanded, she ate, and with each bite her certainty in the ideology she once served crumbled further. She wondered if strength lay not in blind loyalty, but in the courage to see what was before her. That kindness could arrive draped in the enemy's uniform. Music deepened the shift. One evening, American guards invited the prisoners to hear a phonograph spin out jazz tunes, the notes bright and restless, so unlike the martial marches they had been raised upon. The younger girl found her foot tapping despite herself, then blushed when the guard noticed and grinned. She wanted to despise the sound, but her body betrayed her, swaying with the rhythm. Later, in the barracks, she hummed fragments of the melody, unable to stop. The older skeptics scolded her for forgetting who they were, But even she admitted the tune lingered in her mind like a stubborn ember. The fence remained, sharp as ever, yet its meaning shifted. Where once it marked the line between safety and danger, it now symbolized a new paradox. The captivity that granted more dignity than the freedom of a ruined homeland. The women began to argue quietly in bunks. Was it wrong to feel gratitude, or was it only human? Some refused to bend, insisting America's kindness was calculated, a trick to shame them into doubt. Yet even those voices trembled, betraying that doubt had already seeped in. One day, an older woman received news that her son had died on the Eastern Front. She collapsed in grief, wailing into her blanket. It was an American guard, awkward and stiff, who placed a hand on her shoulder. He did not speak German, but his presence alone carried weight. The nurse, watching, felt her throat tighten. For years she had been taught to see Americans as faceless enemies, yet here was one standing silent in sympathy. She realized in that instant that propaganda could never account for touch, for gestures too raw to be scripted. Laughter, too, carried its own rebellion against old beliefs. The guards' clumsy attempts at German, their fumbling with guttural sounds, often sent the women into fits. Once, a soldier meant to say good morning, but instead declared something about goats, sending the barracks into shrieks of laughter. The absurdity was disarming. How could they maintain hatred in the face of such foolishness? The enemy, it seemed, was not a monster but a farm boy with bad grammar. Yet transformation was not without guilt. Many nights, the women lay awake, haunted by the thought that they were adjusting too easily. To feel safe in captivity, to laugh with guards, to relish food denied to their own families. These realities gnawed at them, like betrayal woven into survival. The nurse in particular struggled, torn between loyalty to memory and the undeniable evidence of her senses. She clutched her brother's photograph, whispering that she had not forgotten, though even as she said it, she felt the ground shifting beneath her. The girl with the soap, now worn smooth from handling, began to see it not as a trinket of survival, but as a symbol of something larger. Soap, once scarce, once precious, had become a metaphor for clarity, for the stripping away of lies. She began to believe that truth, like cleanliness, stung at first but healed in the end. Holding it, she imagined that perhaps there was another way to live beyond what she had been taught. By the summer, the transformation was undeniable. The women who once walked with shoulders tight and eyes hard now found themselves softening, their gazes lingering on sunsets beyond the fence, their thoughts daring to imagine futures not bound by ideology. Belief, once rigid, now bent like a reed in the wind. Yet the bending carried its own danger. For what would become of them when they returned to a homeland demanding loyalty to ruins? As cicadas droned in the twilight, the nurse whispered to the girl with the soap, her voice heavy with fear and wonder. If the enemy has shown us mercy, what does that make of everything we believed? The girl turned the soap in her palm, feeling its dwindling edges, and said nothing. The silence was answer enough, a silence that stretched long into the night, heavy with a question neither dared to answer aloud. If captivity could shatter faith, what storms awaited when freedom came again? The ships moved slowly across the Atlantic, their hulls heavy with passengers who did not cheer, did not sing, but stood in silence against the railings as waves struck wood. The war was over, the camps were emptying, and the German women who had spent months or years behind American barbed wire now faced the uncertainty of return. The nurse, thinner than when she had arrived but no longer gaunt, pressed her forehead against the salt-damp rail and tried to summon joy. Freedom should have tasted sweet, yet all she felt was dread. When they disembarked, reality greeted them not with banners or embraces, but with rubble. Towns lay broken, streets gutted by bombs, and the people who had survived moved like shadows. Children's cheeks were hollow, mothers' eyes sunken, fathers absent altogether. The women carried their bundles and walked among them, disoriented by the contrast. They had left behind bunks and fences, but they had also left behind food, medicine, and the uneasy comfort of safety. Now liberty meant hunger. The younger girl who once pocketed lavender soap clutched it still, worn nearly flat, its fragrance faded, but its meaning sharper than ever. She turned it over in her palm as she stepped across the cracked stones of her childhood street, whispering to herself that she would not let go of it, not yet. Neighbors whispered when they returned, calling them lucky, even mocking. "You were well fed by the Americans while we starved." The words cut deep, for they were true in ways the women did not know how to deny. The nurse, trying to console her mother with tales of kindness in captivity, saw disbelief harden across the older woman's face. It was easier for those who had endured Germany's misery to imagine suffering everywhere, not comfort in the hands of the enemy. So the nurse fell silent, carrying her memories like a burden, sharing them only with those who had lived the same contradiction. Guilt weighed heavier than any ration sack. They remembered butter melting on bread while their families scraped potato peels. They remembered hot water on their shoulders while their children shivered in basements during air raids. To speak of such things was to invite anger, so they spoke of them only in whispers at night, or in letters never sent. The girl with the soap tucked it into a drawer each time she feared discovery, then took it out again as if she could not breathe without it. She told herself it was not indulgence but survival, a reminder that humanity could exist even in the enemy's hands. Some tried to bury the past, scrubbing it clean from memory. Others, though, could not escape the transformation that captivity had carved into them. The nurse found herself listening to jazz through broken radios, the rhythms once foreign now strangely comforting. The skeptical woman, hardened by suspicion in the camps, admitted to a neighbor that she had survived too well, then bit her tongue before saying more. The younger girl dreamed of the fence at night, but not with fear. Instead, she dreamed of the paradox it represented, a barrier that held her prisoner yet shielded her from chaos. Years passed, and the women built lives in a Germany that struggled to stitch itself back together. Some married, some moved to new towns, some never spoke of America again. But memory has a way of clinging, like steam on glass. The showers remained vivid in their minds, the hiss of water becoming a ghostly refrain. The soap, when it finally crumbled to nothing, was remembered more clearly than uniforms, guard towers, or even the voyage home. It had become a symbol of something larger. That truth could arrive wrapped in contradiction, that mercy could survive even in the architecture of war. Historians would later calculate the numbers. More than 400,000 German prisoners held in America, with fewer than 1% dying in captivity. Compared to the staggering mortality in Soviet camps, the survival was astonishing. But statistics could never capture what the women carried, an internal fracture between what they had been told and what they had lived. They had entered captivity expecting beatings and starvation. They left it questioning the foundations of belief itself. The nurse grew old still remembering the young doctor's hands, the quiet way he had stitched her wound. The girl who once pressed soap to her lips kept its memory alive in stories told only to her children, stories of warmth and contradiction. She never forgot the shame of walking home through ruined streets with a stomach that had not known hunger in months, nor the unspoken resentment in the eyes of her neighbors. Yet she also never forgot that first rush of steam, the moment the world proved itself more complicated than any ideology. In the end, captivity had not broken them. It had altered them, reshaped them into women who understood that even enemies could be capable of grace. That realization was both gift and curse. Gift because it kept bitterness from poisoning them entirely, curse because it left them forever divided from those who had only known ruin. The barbed wire had vanished, but an invisible line remained, drawn not by fences but by memory. One evening, decades later, the girl, now a grandmother, sat alone at her kitchen table, turning a small box in her hands. Inside was a sliver no larger than a coin, the last remnant of the soap she had carried across the ocean. Its scent was gone, its texture brittle, but to her it was still heavy with meaning. She closed the box and whispered that she had kept it not out of sentiment, but out of duty. For her, it was proof that even in the darkest war, there had been warmth, and that warmth had changed her forever. She leaned back in her chair, eyes misted, and thought of the nurse, the skeptical woman, the guards who had laughed, the fences that had glinted at dawn. The war had ended, the years had passed, but the question remained, echoing still in the silence of her kitchen. If the enemy could offer mercy, what did that say about the world she had once believed in? The answer eluded her, yet the question itself was enough to haunt her until the end, like steam that lingers long after the water has gone cold. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.